Glen Rogers was convicted here in the Hillsborough County Courthouse of the murder of Tina Marie Cribbs. The woman who prosecuted the case is now a Hillsborough County judge, and many people may have forgotten about the man they once called the cross-country killer. But for those of us who remember this case, this is one of the most infamous murder trials in Tampa Bay history.
On the evening of May 15th, 2025, inside a small execution chamber at Florida State Prison, a serial killer stared through the glass one final time. Witnesses expected silence, maybe an apology, maybe fear. Instead, Glen Edward Rogers looked up and delivered a message to the President of the United States. "President Trump, keep making America great." Then he said, "I'm ready to go." Minutes later, the drugs entered his body. At exactly 6:16 p.m., Glen Rogers was pronounced dead. For nearly 30 years, America had known him by terrifying names. The Casanova Killer, the cross-country killer, a handsome drifter with piercing blue eyes, a man who could charm women inside bars within minutes, then leave them dead hours later. Authorities officially tied him to murders in multiple states. But Rogers claimed something even darker. He once told investigators he had killed around 70 people. 70. Later, he took the statement back. But by then, the legend had already spread across America. And somehow, even that was not the strangest part of his story. Years after his arrest, a shocking documentary would suggest Glen Rogers might have been connected to one of the most infamous murder cases in American history. The killings of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. The theory exploded across television screens. People began asking the same horrifying question. What if O.J. Simpson wasn't the only possible killer? The LAPD strongly rejected the idea. They said there was no evidence linking Rogers to the murders. But the rumors never completely disappeared. By the time Florida prepared his execution in 2025, Glen Rogers had become something larger than a normal death row inmate. To some people, he was a manipulative liar who exaggerated everything. To others, he was one of America's most dangerous, unidentified serial predators. And even in his final moments, he left behind another mystery. Just before the lethal injection began, Rogers told the victims' families, "I know there's a lot of questions that you need answers to. I promise you in the near future the questions will be answered." What questions? He never explained. No confession followed. No hidden evidence appeared. Only silence. Then the execution started. The man once feared across multiple states slowly stopped breathing while witnesses watched from behind reinforced glass. His final meal had been strangely ordinary. Pizza, chocolate cake, and soda. But nothing about Glen Rogers was ordinary. Because long before death row, long before the headlines, there was a childhood filled with violence, chaos, and darkness. And some investigators believe that is where the monster truly began. Long before America knew the name Glen Edward Rogers, he was just another boy growing up in a troubled home in Hamilton, Ohio. Born in the early 1960s, Rogers entered a world filled with instability, violence, and fear. People who knew the family later described chaos inside the household. Police visits, alcohol abuse, fighting, constant tension. The kind of environment where children learned very early that survival mattered more than love. By the time Glen was still very young, neighbors already noticed something disturbing about him. He had a violent temper, quick mood swings, and an unusual ability to lie without emotion. Some reports claimed he struggled badly in school. Others said he drifted through life almost invisible, constantly moving, never forming stable relationships. But there was one thing Glen Rogers learned very well: charm. As he grew older, he discovered he could manipulate people easily, especially women. He was tall, good-looking, soft-spoken when he wanted to be. He could enter a bar full of strangers and leave with someone who trusted him within an hour. That skill would later become one of the deadliest weapons he possessed. By his late teenage years and early adulthood, Rogers was already building a criminal record. Assault, theft, violence. Nothing yet suggested the scale of horror to come, but investigators later said the warning signs were everywhere. And then there was the drifting. Glen Rogers rarely stayed in one place. He He moved from state to state like a ghost. Florida, California, Mississippi, Louisiana, Kentucky, always arriving suddenly, always disappearing just as fast. No stable job, no real home, only highways, cheap motels, bars, and strangers. The perfect lifestyle for a predator. Because in the early 1990s, America was a very different place. No smartphones, no social media, no instant tracking. A dangerous man could cross multiple states before police departments even connected the crimes. And Rogers understood that. Some investigators believe he carefully studied how vulnerable women behaved around him. He targeted trust. Not force at first. Not fear. Trust. He flirted. He smiled. He listened. Then something changed. The mask came off. One former acquaintance later described him as having dead eyes once anger appeared. Another said his personality could switch in seconds like a completely different human being. But the scariest part? People often liked him before they feared him. And for several years, that charm allowed him to move unnoticed across America. Until the bodies started appearing. Women found strangled. Victims abandoned far from where they met him. Cases spreading across different states. At first, law enforcement did not realize the murders might be connected. Different jurisdictions, different detectives, different evidence. But behind all of them, investigators would eventually notice the same shadow. A drifter with blue eyes. A man who always seemed calm after violence. A man named Glen Rogers. And soon the killings would become impossible to ignore. The terrifying thing about Glen Rogers was that he did not look dangerous. He did not stalk dark alleyways with a knife in his hand. He did not appear like the monsters people imagine from horror movies. Instead, he looked normal, friendly, relaxed, confident, and that made him far more deadly. During the early 1990s, Rogers traveled across America searching for his next opportunity. Bars became his hunting ground. He would sit quietly at first watching people, studying them, waiting. Then he would approach women with an almost effortless charm. Witnesses later said he had a way of making people feel comfortable very quickly. A smile, a joke, a compliment, nothing unusual, until it was too late. One of the most well-known victims was a woman named Tina Cribbs. She met Rogers inside a bar in Florida in the mid-1990s. To everyone around them, the interaction looked harmless. Just two adults talking. Later that night, witnesses saw Tina leave with Rogers. It was the last time many people ever saw her alive. Her body was later discovered inside a motel bathtub. She had been brutally stabbed. The crime scene shocked investigators because of how cold and personal the attack appeared. This was not random rage. It felt controlled, intentional, and Rogers had already vanished. That pattern would repeat again and again. Women met him, trusted him, disappeared. In another case, a woman named Sandra Gallagher encountered Rogers in California. Not long afterward, she was found dead, strangled. Authorities slowly began noticing similarities between the murders. The victims were often alone when they met him. Many encountered him in bars or social settings. And after each killing, Rogers moved on to another state before police could fully react. It was like chasing smoke across the country. But what truly terrified investigators were the stories from women who survived encounters with him. Some later described sudden explosions of anger over tiny things. Others remembered feeling an overwhelming sense of danger only after being alone with him. By then, escape became difficult. People started comparing Rogers to another infamous serial killer, Ted Bundy, not because the crimes were identical, but because both men used appearance and charm as weapons. That comparison horrified the public. America had seen this kind of predator before. A handsome drifter, manipulative, intelligent enough to gain trust, violent enough to kill without remorse. And according to some investigators, Glen Rogers may have enjoyed the fear he created afterward. Years later, disturbing reports emerged claiming Rogers bragged about killing people. In prison conversations, he allegedly suggested the number of victims could be far higher than authorities proved. At one point, he even claimed responsibility for around 70 murders across the United States. Law enforcement never confirmed those claims. Some detectives believed he exaggerated to gain attention. Others feared the opposite, that he was telling the truth, because the reality was already horrifying enough. By the middle of the 1990s, multiple states were searching for the same man, and police were finally beginning to understand something chilling. Glen Rogers was not losing control. He was becoming more confident, more mobile, more experienced, more dangerous. But eventually one mistake would end the killing spree. A single trail of evidence, a stolen vehicle, and a nationwide manhunt that finally closed in on the man America would soon call the cross-country killer. By the time authorities fully realized how dangerous Glen Rogers truly was, he had already crossed multiple state lines and left a trail of fear behind him. Police departments across America began sharing information. Different murders, different victims, but the same type of suspect kept appearing. Tall, blonde hair, blue eyes, charming, always moving. And then came the break investigators desperately needed. After the murder of Tina Cribbs in Florida, Rogers stole her vehicle and disappeared. That decision changed everything, because now police were no longer chasing a faceless drifter. They were tracking a fugitive connected to a stolen car, tied directly to a homicide investigation. The search exploded nationwide. Law enforcement agencies across several states circulated his photograph. Television stations aired warnings. Newspapers printed his face. Authorities told the public he could be extremely dangerous. But Glen Rogers kept moving. Witnesses later reported sightings in different parts of the country. Truck stops, motels, highways. It was as if he never intended to stop running. Then finally, in Kentucky, the manhunt came to an end. In November of the mid-1990s, officers located Rogers after receiving information connected to the stolen vehicle investigation. When police approached him, Rogers reportedly attempted to avoid capture. But this time, there was nowhere left to go. The drifter who had spent years moving from state to state was finally in handcuffs. For investigators, the arrest felt like the beginning of something even darker. Because once Rogers entered interrogation rooms, the stories started changing constantly. Sometimes he denied involvement. Other times he hinted at more killings. And occasionally he appeared to enjoy confusing investigators. Detectives quickly realized they were dealing with someone highly manipulative. A man who liked control, even from inside a jail cell. But the evidence against him in Florida was overwhelming. Witness testimony, the stolen car, physical evidence connected to Tina Cribbs' murder. Prosecutors prepared for trial while the media began turning Glen Rogers into a national headline. That was when another shocking twist appeared. Years after his arrest, Rogers began making bizarre claims connected to the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. According to later documentaries and interviews, Rogers allegedly claimed he had once worked around O.J. Simpson and suggested he was involved in the killings. The accusations created massive controversy. Some people immediately dismissed the story as another manipulation tactic from a serial killer seeking attention. Others became obsessed with the possibility. Television programs revisited the theory. Online discussions exploded. Conspiracy theories spread everywhere. But investigators from a Los Angeles police department publicly rejected the claims. Authorities said there was no credible evidence connecting Rogers to those murders. Still, the damage was done. The rumors attached themselves permanently to his name. And while the public argued over theories, prosecutors focused on the victims everyone already knew he had taken. Inside the courtroom, the image of the charming drifter began collapsing. Jurors heard horrifying details about the crimes, about how Rogers gained trust, about how quickly violence followed. Witnesses described a predator who moved through America, leaving destruction behind him. Then came the verdict. Guilty. The sentence was death. And just like that, Glen Edward Rogers joined the long, silent rows of inmates on Florida's death row. But even after sentencing, the darkness around him did not disappear. Because prison guard, investigators, and journalists would all notice the same disturbing thing over the years. Glen Rogers never seemed fully human when discussing death. Almost no remorse. Almost no emotion, only cold fascination. And as execution day slowly approached, decade after decade, America kept asking the same question. How many people did Glen Rogers really kill? After the trial ended, Glen Edward Rogers disappeared behind the concrete walls of Florida's death row. For most killers, that is where the story fades away. Years pass quietly. Appeals drag on. Public attention disappears. But Rogers was different. Even inside prison, he continued creating headlines. The man once accused of murdering women across America spent nearly 3 decades waiting for execution. Nearly 30 years of locked doors, steel bars, and isolation. Yet investigators and journalists who spoke with him often walked away unsettled. Because Rogers rarely behaved like a man haunted by guilt. Sometimes he joked. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes he hinted there were things authorities still did not know. And those hints kept the mystery alive. Over the years, Rogers gave interviews where he made disturbing statements about additional murders. At times, he claimed responsibility for dozens of killings across America. Then later, he would contradict himself. Some experts believed he was a pathological liar desperate for attention. Others warned that serial killers often mix truth with fiction to maintain control over investigators. That uncertainty became part of his legend. No one fully knew when he was telling the truth, or when he was manipulating everyone around him. Meanwhile, the families of victims continued waiting. Year after year, appeals delayed the execution repeatedly. Legal motions continued. Questions about evidence and procedure moved through the courts. For the victims' families, every delay reopened old wounds. And then there was the media fascination. Documentaries revisited his crimes. True crime programs debated the possibility of additional victims. Some productions focused heavily on the O.J. Simpson connection claims. Again and again, authorities rejected those allegations. But Rogers seemed to enjoy the chaos surrounding his name. Former investigators later described him as someone who liked feeling powerful even from a prison cell. That may explain why his final years became filled with cryptic comments and strange interviews. At one point, reporters asked whether he felt remorse. His answers often sounded detached, cold, unpredictable. The charming drifter from the 1990s had become an aging man sitting under fluorescent prison lights, yet the darkness around him remained unchanged. As execution dates approached, over the years legal teams continued fighting. Arguments about lethal injection procedures, appeals connected to constitutional issues, efforts to stop the execution at the last minute. But eventually the courts ran out of patience. Florida scheduled the execution for May of 2025. Suddenly, the waiting was over. News outlets across America began covering the case again. The cross-country killer was finally nearing the end. Reporters revisited his crimes. Victims' families prepared emotionally for closure. And prison officials quietly began the final preparations required for an execution. For Rogers, the countdown had begun. His final weeks were heavily monitored. Every movement documented. Every visitor recorded. Every meal observed. Then came the final questions reporters always ask death row inmates. What would his last meal be? What would his final words say? Would he confess to anything else before dying? No one knew. But inside Florida State Prison, the execution team was already preparing the chamber. Because after nearly 30 years on death row, Glen Edward Rogers was finally running out of time. May 15th, 2025. Inside Florida State Prison, the final day of Glen Edward Rogers' life had arrived. For prison staff, the procedure was carefully planned down to the minute. Security checks, medical preparations, witness arrangements. Everything followed strict protocol. But beyond the prison walls, media attention was building rapidly. News stations across America prepared live coverage. True crime communities flooded online discussions. And the families connected to the victims waited for the moment they had imagined for decades. Meanwhile, inside his death row cell, Glen Rogers spent his final hours under constant observation. According to official reports, he appeared calm, not emotional, not panicked. Calm. That detail disturbed some observers more than anger ever could. Because after nearly 30 years awaiting execution, the man, known as the cross-country killer, showed very little visible fear. As the afternoon moved forward, Rogers received his final meal. Pizza, chocolate cake, and soda. Simple, ordinary. A strangely normal meal for a man accused of extraordinary violence. Then came the final legal checks. In many executions, attorneys race against the clock, trying to stop the procedure at the last moment. But this time the courts refused intervention. The execution would proceed. As evening approached, witnesses were escorted into the viewing area. Among them were journalists, officials, and people connected to the victims. Beyond the glass sat the execution chamber itself. Bright lights, cold walls, a gurney prepared in the center of the room. Then the doors opened. Glen Rogers entered the chamber. Witnesses later described him as physically older and heavier than the man once shown in wanted posters during the 1990s. But the eyes remained familiar. Cold, focused, unsettling. Prison staff secured him onto the gurney while the room fell silent. This is usually the moment when condemned inmates deliver apologies, prayers, or emotional final statements. Instead, Rogers said something nobody expected. First, he addressed the victims' families. "I know there's a lot of questions that you need answers to. I promise you in the near future the questions will be answered." The statement immediately confused witnesses. What questions? What answers? Was he referring to other murders? Hidden evidence? More victims? He never explained. Then moments later, Rogers turned attention toward politics. "President Trump, keep making America great." The comment stunned parts of the room. Even in his final seconds, Glen Rogers managed to leave behind another controversy. Then he ended with a final sentence. "I'm ready to go." Seconds later, the lethal injection process began. Witnesses watched silently as the drugs entered his body. At first, Rogers moved slightly. Then the movement stopped. The chamber became almost completely still. Minutes passed. Finally, at approximately 6:16 p.m., prison officials pronounced Glen Edward Rogers dead. The cross-country killer was gone. But even after the execution ended, the uncertainty surrounding him remained alive. Because no one could answer the question haunting the entire case. How many people had Glen Rogers really murdered? And perhaps even more disturbing, did he take secrets to the grave that America will never uncover? When the execution of Glen Edward Rogers finally ended, many people expected closure. Instead, what remained was uncertainty. For the families connected to the victims, the death sentence brought an ending to decades of waiting. No more appeals. No more hearings. No more chances for Rogers to manipulate attention from inside a prison cell. But closure and answers are not always the same thing. And Glen Rogers left behind far more questions than explanations. To this day, investigators officially confirmed only a limited number of murders connected directly to him. Yet the rumors surrounding his true victim count never disappeared. Some believe Rogers exaggerated constantly because he enjoyed fear and media attention. Others believe authorities may never fully know how many women crossed paths with him during those years drifting across America. Because serial predators like Rogers often survive through invisibility. Cheap motels, highways, bars, temporary jobs, false stories. People disappear every year without national headlines. And that reality still terrifies investigators. The case also became another reminder of how dangerous charm can be. Glen Rogers did not appear monstrous at first glance. That was the point. The most dangerous predators are often the ones who understand trust better than kindness itself. Women spoke to him because he seemed normal, safe, friendly. And for some victims, that decision became fatal. Then there is the controversy that still follows his name even after death. The O.J. Simpson murder claims. Despite documentaries and public speculation, authorities never found credible evidence linking Rogers to the killings of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. Many experts believe Rogers simply used one of America's most famous murder cases to keep attention focused on himself. And in a disturbing way, it worked. Even after execution, people continue debating him online. But perhaps the most haunting moment came during his final statement. "I promise you the questions will be answered." Those words continue to disturb people because nothing followed them. No heathen confession. No secret documents. No new evidence. Only silence. Maybe Rogers wanted one final moment of control before death. Or maybe somewhere in America, there are still crimes connected to him that investigators never solved. That possibility may never disappear. Today, the prison cell that once held Glen Rogers sits empty. The execution chamber has moved on to other names, other cases, other condemned inmates. But the story of the cross-country killer remains part of America's darker history. A drifter who moved through the country, leaving violence behind him. A manipulator who blurred truth and lies until nobody knew where one ended and the other began. And in the end, even death did not fully silence the mystery surrounding him. Because sometimes the most frightening thing about serial killers is not only what they did. It is how much they may have taken to the grave forever.